Hello and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, where we take you back to the good old days, just maybe not quite how you expect from our title. My name is Megan Cox.
And my name is Clayton Becker. And today, Megan, what are we going to talk about? What have we brought everyone here for?
Today, we are going to be discussing how we should reject election conspiracies and embrace working the polls. But we wanted to make sure we had the absolute best information for you today, so we have a special guest.
We brought in an expert on election policy. Her name is Maddie Covino, and as has been a recurring theme with guests on this podcast, she is an old friend. We went to undergraduate together at Columbia and Sciences Po in France, and she now works in election administration for the Campaign Legal Center. Though we should note up at the top that she is here in her individual capacity, not representing the Campaign Legal Center on this podcast today. So Maddie, tell us a little bit more about yourself. What brought you to election administration, and what are you doing now?
Yeah, I'm super happy to be here. Hello, Clayton and Megan. So I have been working in election policy and election administration really since I graduated, I'd say. I started at an organization that was focused on implementing mail ballot policy in the 2020 election, which feels like a while ago now, but was probably like the most notable election for mail ballots in our nation's history. There were a lot of mail ballots being sent out in states that had never done them before. And so I had the opportunity to work with some policymakers who had been election officials themselves. And so the organization that I was working for was really focused on the election admin side of the operation. I think that there's often, sort of like the voting rights side of things and the election administration side of things. And then sometimes on the more nefarious side, that's like election integrity zone. And so I think I've had experience sort of on the voting rights and the election admin angle. And that sort of launched my love affair with the election administration side of this work. I took a brief hiatus and thought maybe I could get a PhD like you fine folks, and made it about a year, and then decided that I really wanted to be back working in state policy. So now what I do is I work for the Campaign Legal Center on their state policy team. It's an organization that is made up of all different sorts of folks, but largely litigators who litigate election-related cases in campaign finance and voting rights and ethics. But we do have a policy side of the house, and I really focus on sort of what I like to call like the most boring aspects of elections, what I hope will be the most boring aspects of elections. But I think we've sort of opened a Pandora's box on how boring election administration really can be at this point. But things like, how much time do election administrators have to do each task that needs to happen for an election to be completed?
Oh, I mean, it's only boring when it works, right? Which is the problem.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's kind of like if you know the referee's name at the end of the game, right? Then they haven't done their job, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was one thing you glossed over there a little bit, Maddie, which is you do have experience working in election offices directly. We want to make sure that this is drawn out. You worked for a summer, I believe, right? In the Denver County Recorder's office and their elections division.
I did. I worked for the Denver County Clerk and Recorder. I worked largely with their elections division for a summer. That was sort of like done after my PhD when I decided, okay, I really need to get back to election administration, this thing I love so much. And I was there I actually got to be there like for an election, which was great. Obviously, these offices are working year round on lots of different things because election season isn't just like a day or a week or a month. It takes all year. But I was there for a mayoral runoff in Denver County, which was a really big race at the time and was very fun and very getting to see the nuts and bolts of the process, which I think would be enlightening for almost anyone who works in this field.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. And we will plumb that knowledge for sure.
Absolutely.
I'm happy to share it.
Outstanding. Well, do we want to get into the meat of the episode?
Let's get into it. We've brought Maddie here for her expertise, so let's go ahead and we'll start asking her some things. So I guess before we get into maybe the like conspiracies around elections and maybe like misapprehensions that people have about elections, could you give us like a 3-4 minute summary maybe of like how voting and election administration sort of actually works at the county level, since I think most people don't know that even that most elections in the United States are administered by county offices, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, could you give us a summary, sort of just how that process works?
Definitely. So you're totally right, Clayton. Elections are not administered, I mean, certainly not at the national level, but they're always administered at the state and local level. And how local you go down really depends on the state that you are in, because federalism, and that's how we've decided to do it. So, what I like to say is, like, as much as you can become sort of an expert in election administration generally, every state, and then even within that, every county and maybe even every town is going to be doing things slightly differently, though there are general standards of practice for running an election. And sort of like broad strokes to describe how an election happens in our country is basically you have these local election administrators, and depending upon how big the jurisdiction is, their job may just be elections. It may also be elections and DMV. It might be elections, DMV, the deed to your house. It could be all of these different things put together. These people are public servants. But there are a lot of things that happen prior to election day. I mean, I think we've had this sort of movement recently where the voting period, the time where people cast a ballot, isn't just a single day anymore, but there's everything that has to happen before voters can begin casting a ballot, everything that happens when voters are casting ballots, everything that happens then between when the polls close and when results are certified. And I sort of want to draw the distinction between the certification and when what we might say is like when we know the results, right?
Yeah.
So like when
and these
says,
timescales are like very different from one another, right? Like you have
Totally.
months of effort that goes into like figuring out exactly what's going to happen on the day, right? Or like during the season, right? The few weeks, shall
The
we say,
voting period.
the voting period. But then everyone seemingly expects that they're going to turn all those votes around immediately, right? Like all of the prep work, they're like, if they're aware of the prep work in the first place, people have this idea that, well, then you should be able to turn things around immediately, right? Because you've done all of this prep work, right? But that's like not 100% true. I feel like people, when we sort of were talking about the prep for this episode, you mentioned that people have this idea that fast results means secure elections. Is that true? What should we be thinking about if it's not true, I guess I should say, what should we be thinking about instead?
Yeah, I mean, fast results do not mean secured elections. They're not like a tied entity. People obviously want results fast. Candidates want it quickly. Voters want it quickly. But how quick you get a result is really dependent, again, upon your state. It's dependent upon how your state is running the election, how the county is running the election, what types of ballots people are using to cast their vote, whether that's a mail ballot, whether that's an early ballot that they voted in person, whether they voted in person on election day, and then how close the race is. I think like even just looking back on the 2024 election, we got results in Pennsylvania pretty fast for the presidential race. That was certainly not the case in 2020. Well, it was closer in 2020 than it was in 2024. And there wasn't a complete overhaul of Pennsylvania's election system between those two things. We also had fewer mail ballots in Pennsylvania in 2024 than we had in 2020. Though I want to caveat that by saying you can still have quick results with mail ballots. It just sort of depends on what other supporting policies you're pairing with the mail ballots. So, it's a complicated answer to a simple question, which is really to say, like, how long it takes for you to get results. It just depends on so many factors. And there are ways to get faster results through administrative changes by making sure that administrators have the time and the resources that they need to, if mail ballots are coming in, pre-process those mail ballots, right? Like prepare to count them once polls close on election day.
And that's things like taking them out of the privacy envelope sort of thing.
Right. Like scanning them in, doing signature verification, which you
there
want to do.
There are certain states that like don't let you pre-process mail-in ballots, right? Like you cannot start.
Pennsylvania is one of them.
Yeah, you cannot start opening them until I think in Pennsylvania it's the morning of election day, right? So you've gotten like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of mail ballots in the weeks prior to election day, but you can't actually start opening any of them until that morning. At which point you have to open tens of thousands of envelopes.
All of them. And again, like even that is a feasible task if you decide you're going to put a whole bunch of manpower behind it.
Yeah.
But deciding, that you're going to have like the regular amount of election officials and just have them work through the night for several days is not a super sustainable option in any state. So, we see too in election administration, like the states that decide to mail everyone a mail ballot, like our Colorados and our Washingtons, and more recently our Californias, but maybe not. Maybe we're not going to use that in this case because I don't know as much about that system. Those states are almost always pairing their mailing of a ballot with a lot of other policies like processing those mail ballots quickly, before election day, doing something called clearing the decks, right? Wanting to make sure that like by the time we hit election day, we've done as much as we can prior to the ballots that we know are going to come in on election day because, mail ballots will sit on someone's kitchen counter and then they remember that they want to drop it off at 6 p.m. on Tuesday. But just because that person wants to drop off the ballot at 6 p.m. on Tuesday, like that's not the reason why your results are slow necessarily.
Well, so I guess to piggyback on that, though, there are like trade-offs that I suppose we make here between voting access, so to speak, and the certification of results, like when we get results. Like I know California, for example, I know you didn't want to use California perhaps because you don't know quite as much about it, but it's where I live, right? So
fair enough.
I know that one of the reasons that California takes so long to count ballots is because they have really permissive rules for when the ballots can be received. Like as long as they are postmarked by election day, they can be received long afterwards. But at the same time, there does appear to be a sort of lack of those supportive policies in California that mean that even with these permissive rules, you should be able to count a lot faster than California counts election results. I guess what I'm asking here, the sort of long-winded way of asking this question is, what are bad reasons why it takes so long to count ballots? And is that part of like where these conspiracies come from in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, certainly not having those supportive policies like we talked about, not having pre-processing, not properly outfitting election offices, not having the right number of election officials to do the job that is going to be required. And sometimes, it's more niche things too, right? Like if election officials are going to have a ton of physical ballots that they need to count, they need the physical space to count those ballots. And so sometimes that means like you need to get them the right space. They need a warehouse.
Set them up at the county fairgrounds or something.
Exactly. I mean, I remember during the 2021 governor recall in California, was that when it happened?
Think so, yeah.
Yeah. I think it was that fall. I toured the LA County election facility, which was like the biggest warehouse I had ever seen. And it was the craziest. I mean, to me, it was very cool, but it was the craziest operation. And it was beautiful, like to see laid out how a ballot could go from one place all the way down the line in its processing. And I think that's generally considered to be like a very good facility. I don't know if it's a permanent facility or if it's something that they just had for the election season. Sometimes that's what they do. They'll have a temporary space. But then even like temporary spaces can be difficult because you need to have proper security around those spaces. So, making sure that election officials have the physical resources, that they have enough time, that there's enough coordination between the local and the state if there needs to be. So, something about like, if we're talking about getting results, sometimes there are recounts, and that is like, that causes a delay in us having results. And, we're really having a delay because if it's a recount, it's probably close. So we want to be really sure. And in a lot of cases, there are requirements that, states come back and double check machines. They do like a second round of testing on machines before a recount starts. Okay, well, how long does the state have to do that testing, right? Is it the Secretary of State that needs to go to every county? Can the counties test themselves? Like, these are all really, I mean, someone's probably listening to this thinking this is quite boring and specific, but like, these are the things that have to happen for an election to happen, but that we're not always thinking about when we're watching CNN or Fox or MSNBC and like looking at the result being called.
And it's that lack of knowledge that I think we're trying to address here. We do, I think, skew fairly wonky in our audience, I would imagine, but we're trying to fill that gap because if you have never thought about the fact that every single ballot has to be removed from 2 separate envelopes and have its signature checked against whatever database you're using, etc., that is a thing that takes time. You are not merely putting the ballot through your Scantron-esque machine. You are doing all of these steps times hundreds of thousands. And
even in
in
the smallest states, right? You're doing this times hundreds of thousands, right? And in a state like California, where there are 20 some million votes, right? Every election, you're doing it tens of millions of times, right?
Yeah.
Across the state.
Absolutely.
I will say, there are different types of ballots require different amounts of time to be processed, right? Like sometimes when I'm saying, it needs to be removed from 2 envelopes, it needs to be signature checked, that is true for mail ballots, but would not necessarily be true for a ballot cast on a machine in person. But it's the balance of the different types of voting options that are provided in order to make sure our elections are accessible. And it's the balance of those options with those supportive policies that we've talked about that can make sure that results come in a timely manner, right? Like the answer doesn't have to be, well, everyone just has to vote on election day and they have to vote on a machine and they have to show an ID and, that's how we're going to get results super fast. Because we still want to make sure that people who are eligible to participate in our democracy are able to participate.
Yeah, well,
yes. Speed isn't the only thing that matters here.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, Florida in the year 2000 would put a little bit of a damper on if everyone goes and votes in person on the day, then we'll get results really quickly.
Yeah, exactly. But what I'm hearing from some of this as we kind of think about what's a real problem, what needs to be fixed, the bad reasons that elections can take a long time to show their results and be certified are reasons that can be fixed with resource investment. And we often find that people really hate to pour more money on something they think is done badly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I also will say, and I think that, this is a big conversation that's happening right now about sort of in the policy space of results coming quickly and how much that matters. And while I think I'm trying to sort of thread the needle and saying a lot of the time when people complain about it, it's not really a real issue or we're focusing on the wrong things in order to fix the problem. That being said, if slower results are creating sort of mass distrust in an election, that's still something that we need to address because it's important for people to trust our elections. And so I think it's always, it's not unlike a lot of other policies that we see in elections, like voter ID, for example, right? Where if you talk to a lot of policy experts, they'll say voter ID is a bad thing. And if you talk to the average citizen, they'll say voter ID makes a ton of sense, right? People want fast results. People want voter ID. And it is important not to just brush aside that concern, even if maybe we need to nuance the issue a little bit.
Well, to pull out sort of one of the things you said there, Maddie, about how a lot of the problems that people think there are with elections are maybe not the actual problems there are with elections.
Right.
What are some of the to get into the real conspiracy meat of the episode, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the things that people do think are wrong with elections? And I guess, are they either just entirely made up, or is there sort of a kernel of truth to them? And if there is the kernel of truth, then what is it about it that we need to fix there?
Yeah. I mean, there's a laundry list of conspiracy theories at this point, unfortunately. I feel like one of the common ones that we hear is that hand counting ballots is good, machine counting ballots is bad, sort of part of a general theme of analog good, machine bad in elections. Even folks who aren't totally wired into the election administration space probably remember the controversy with the 2020 election and Dominion and the claim that, the Dominion voting machines were switching votes.
And before that, it was Diebold in 2004. This is a perennial thing.
There was
Perennial
also a
problem.
conspiracy about voting machines recording votes for Al Gore in the negative direction in one Florida county in 2000. Like every vote that Al Gore got was actually a vote they took away from his total. It's a long conspiracy.
There's a long and storied
running
tradition. Yeah.
There is. And I think the history of technology and elections is interesting and ever evolving. Clayton and I took a class in undergrad together, and they talk about this. And one of the things our professor mentioned was like, you would be absolutely shocked by the number of election systems that are running on like Windows 2000. And we were taking this class in like,
oh no, I've worked in
2018.
government.
Right. And so, there were also election machines that were like post 2000, post this terrible instance in Florida. There was a funding kind of boon. There was
the Help America Vote Act.
Yes, HAVA. So HAVA money comes in, and a lot of states use HAVA money to buy voting machines, because we all saw what happened with the butterfly ballot and the hanging chads in Florida.
And people punching was the problem.
Right. And people are like, no, technology can fix this issue. And in a lot of states, we ended up with something called DREs, which I think is a direct recording, something with a D.
I think it's electronic something. Yeah. But like, yes, DRE is the term of art.
There are these, which are a form of voting machine, and a lot of states had them in the early 2000s and in the 2010s, including my beloved home state of New Jersey. And the unfortunate truth about these machines is that they don't produce, or not all of them produce, a voter verifiable receipt. Where you cast your ballot, it prints something out, you say, yep, that's what I meant to vote, and you're giving it to the election officials, or you're feeding it into, another machine for it to be counted. What the DRE was doing is you would punch in, and I voted on a DRE, you would punch in your preference, you would press go, it would go into the ether, and they would check what the totals were, and if they did a recount, they would just check the totals again.
Yep, they're like, New Jersey does a recount, and they're like, yep, we asked the machines, and they gave us the same numbers. Looks like we were right the first time.
And, I think that's something that everyone in the election community would be able to admit, like, yeah, those machines were not the best, but also we didn't know, and we have evolved since then, right? Like, as technology evolves, as we learn more, those machines have largely been phased out. New Jersey doesn't use them anymore. And so sort of bring it back to like, are machines bad? Is hand counting good? Machines are a necessary and important tool that election officials are able to use to count the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of ballots that this country casts. People, like human beings, are bad at counting large numbers of things over and over again. We are simply not that good at it. I knit. I can't count stitches to save my life. Like, I have to put in little markers. I'm not very good at it. And so if we're talking about, counting votes on large numbers of ballots, we do want to use machines for that. That's not to say that a human element isn't necessary and important. This is why we do things like audits. Risk limiting audits are some of the best things that we can do to confirm that machines are counting votes correctly. Logic and accuracy testing of machines, which is something that happens prior to the election starting, that also is confirming that the machines are functioning properly. And so it's not like we're just letting the machines go wild, right? Like, there are checks on them. We're making sure that they work correctly, that they've continued to work correctly. But it's a huge, huge lift to have people count ballots by hand only. And to have all ballots counted by hand.
What I'm hearing here is that there's a middle ground, perhaps, between the Simpsons cartoon, where it like accidentally votes 10 times for Romney, and like counting votes by using like a tally system where you mark off 5 things every time you get through 5 ballots, right? Yeah.
Yes, definitely. All right. And election officials are doing that. Like, it's not like just a concept, right? Like, it's something that we're actively using in most jurisdictions.
These perceptions linger, right? That like the stuff from the early 2000s lingers in how people think elections are still run to this day.
Yes.
Another thing that I think people often bring up in these like conspiracy sort of circles, one of the big ones, is the idea that non-citizens are voting all over the place.
Yeah.
Maddie, can you tell us whether this is happening in your frontline experience? Are non-citizens committing rampant voter fraud in states like California and New York?
Well, rampant voter fraud, period, is just not something that happens and is happening. That's not to say that there aren't occasional instances where someone casts a ballot who is not eligible to cast a ballot for, a variety of reasons. There are a lot of reasons that could happen. But for the most part, there are a lot of checks and balances on our election system, and those individuals are caught. We know if someone votes twice. We know if someone is not eligible, but they cast a ballot. We know if, a spouse casts their other spouse's ballot, right? Like, it's not perfect, but it's pretty freaking good.
And we hear about every instance of it happening.
We
as
do.
well.
You hear about it
We
happening
do.
every time that it happens because it is so rare, right?
Because it is so rare.
It's like how every time that something happens on the subway, like you hear about this horrible thing that happened on the New York subway, because it's not common that these things actually happen. Whereas there's
Right.
something like 200 car crashes in New York City every day, and a good number of those result in injuries. There's something like 200 vehicle deaths in New York City every year. And you don't hear about it at all because it's just another Tuesday, right? Like we said sort of up at the top, things are only reported on when they don't work. It's boring
Right.
when it works. And unfortunately, we've had a lot of non-boring elections.
We've had non-boring elections, and not even non-boring elections because things haven't worked. I mean, these are systems, like, we're conducting thousands of elections when we conduct a federal election, right? I think Wisconsin alone has thousands of election jurisdictions, and they're one state. There's a lot of instances for normal mistakes to happen. And the issue really comes when those normal mistakes are sold as coordinated efforts to elect the person that the people didn't choose. And that's where we cause a lot of problems, because it sows distrust in the process. It makes people not trust, not even necessarily the election in their own state, but the elections that are happening in other states that contribute to a national result. And that's sort of how we land ourselves in hot water. I wish I could tell you that there's never going to be a snafu in an election. Like, there is, it's human beings are conducting it. We're doing it so many times over. Of course, there are going to be issues, but what we've seen in recent years around conspiracy theories, the cyber ninjas in Arizona, right? The fake audit of their elections, claiming that there was bamboo woven into the ballot paper. That is not because there was bamboo woven into the ballot paper. There was an ulterior motive there.
It seems as though many of these are results driven, but also just designed to reduce trust in the process.
Yeah.
You don't need a reason for it to be wrong, as long as you're muddying the water about whether or not the election was fair or valid or reflected the will of the voters. If you sow that distrust, that seems to be the objective with a number of these instances. And unfortunately, people who don't have bad faith are picking that information up and are being persuaded by it.
Unfortunately, I think it is probably impossible at this point to get people to stop spreading election-related conspiracies, because they have an ulterior motive. They have a partisan reason to want people to have distrust in the election results, at least up until they find out that their guy actually did win in the end, right? At which point the elections were run perfectly and there was no problem. But there are probably some things that we can do to alleviate some of the susceptibility to these conspiracy theories and just improve election administration while we're at it, right? Both actually improve the process and improve people's perceptions of the process. So I think it's about time for us to take a break. But when we come back, we will talk more about, we have all of these conspiracies, right? We have maybe these problems with election administration, but what do we actually do to solve it? And how can we improve trust in elections in the United States? We'll be back in just a couple of seconds. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. When we left you guys, we were talking about how most of the things that people think are wrong with election administration are perhaps not actually the things that are wrong with election administration, but that nonetheless there is this need to improve the margins, shall we say, of election administration and to enhance public trust in the system. I think the three of us here have a perspective that election administration is perhaps healthier than many people might think, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do. So let's start off with some personal things that each one of us can do to not only improve actual election administration, but improve our own confidence in the system. So, Maddie, what are some of these things that you would advise people to think about when we have elections?
I think the first thing is hold your horses on election night to the extent that you can. Unless it's a real blowout, you're not going to have results the minute that the polls close. You shouldn't want results the minute that the polls close, right? Like, you should want to make sure that folks' ballots are being counted, that proper time is being taken to count those votes. So, don't freak out too much if there's a little bit of a wait. Prepare yourself for a little bit of a wait, particularly if you know that the race is going to be very close. That's sort of my first piece of advice. My second piece of advice would be educate yourself on elections and election administration, because I definitely recognize that the way most people experience elections is they cast a ballot and then they watch the election results roll in on the news, or, they read about it in the paper. And so anything sort of beyond when they cast their ballot is in a black box for them. Be an observer with your local party. Typically the parties run observation programs, or be a poll worker, or be a poll monitor, be an election worker more generally. States always need temporary election officials. Counties need temporary election officials to serve as election judges, to serve as poll workers. Sometimes, you might be doing opening ballot envelopes or doing signature verification or something like that. So there's a lot of different ways for you to get involved in the process. And I think it sheds a lot of light on what's going on. Something I observed in Denver that I think is really cool is for a lot of, I think basically all of the processes that occur with a person's ballot, it's a bipartisan team that's doing that. Mm-hmm. So two people not of the same party, whether that's an independent and a Republican, an independent and a Democrat and a Republican. And that's happening for all processes, but it's happening if, say you're adjudicating what's on the ballot, right? A lot of the time a ballot comes in, there's marks all over. It might not be super clear what the voter meant. Sometimes we're not that smart when we vote. We think we're good at bubbling things in. We're not that good at bubbling things in. And so those two people sit together and they determine to the best of their ability, based on guidance, what it is they believe the voter meant. And that's never done by just someone of one party. And I've been able to speak to people who have done this job. They say, oh yeah, I love doing this job specifically. I've done it for 10 years. There are bipartisan teams that have been bipartisan teams for years. They like working together. It does a lot for your trust in the process, I think, to see your neighbors and your friends and public servants dedicate their time and energy to it and to protecting it. I think probably because I'm just like a big nerd and care about it very much, but like it was very moving to me to see like people's devotion to this process. So
that's a perfectly sensible point to make. And I want to make sure that we pull that out. Your participation in this process doesn't just enhance your own personal trust of the election system. If your family, friends, and neighbors know, oh, Maddie went down to help with the election administration, because they already trust you, they trust the process more as well. So it is kind of a community trust building exercise at that point.
Yeah, and to this point as well, like it's not like there's some sort of, at least within sort of reasonable bounds, like upper limit on the number of volunteers they can take, right?
Right.
And they are always in need of more volunteers. Like if you haven't done this, if you haven't, or I guess especially if you haven't like voted on election day in a while, right? It is underrated just how much of this country's election infrastructure relies on 63-year-old women named Mildred who do this out of the goodness of their hearts.
Totally.
And like have been doing it for the last 25 years without enough volunteers who like are getting into it and doing it for more years and like learning the system. There's this sort of impending cliff where we no longer have enough Mildreds to help run these elections, right? And so if you're thinking, oh, me going in and doing this and like volunteering, that just means someone else isn't going to be doing the volunteering. And so it's like a zero sum thing of how many people I'm going to be able to tell about this experience. Like, no, right? Like your local elections office could almost certainly use more volunteers for election season. They have a big room and half of it's being used, right? There's like all these square feet where they could bring in more tables and more volunteers to count the ballots more efficiently, more quickly, right? You don't have to worry about displacing other volunteers because you've decided to go and be a poll worker for the first time.
Well, and better to volunteer and have them say no, right? Like if they're
Great
at full
point.
capacity, great for your local election jurisdiction, you know? But even, I would say too, I'd add, even if you can't volunteer on election day or during election season, right? Maybe you're a teacher, maybe you have a job that has a stricter schedule and like that's just not going to be an option for you. In a lot of cases, you can still tour local election facilities around election season or not even during election season. And so you can see the machines where ballots are processed. You can see the various rooms that they're using when an election is happening. You know, I think that the tours are probably like of varying levels of excitement depending upon what your jurisdiction is. Like I've been to Orange County in California and like that one's really cool because they print their own ballots in-house. So there's like, or they, at least they used to, I don't know if they still do. So there's like a print shop, which is kind of wild. And they have all that Disney money from like Orange County having Disney. So it's like, it's very awesome. And not all, you know, it might not be like the most exciting facility every time, but I think that seeing the facility for yourself and seeing the election workers, some of whom like that's their full-time job, it also goes a long way, even if you're not directly participating in the process.
Yeah, and expanding these programs as well that like bring people in and to do these tours
Totally.
is like a cool sort of policy and personal thing sort of split. Like I remember, Maddie,
Yes.
you and I talked to a number of election workers at the Ezra conference last year. Yes, last year.
Yeah, last year
At USC, and they were talking about like how much they enjoy doing these tours, right? And how
they love it.
and
Yeah.
how they want more offices in their area to do them more regularly, right? One of them was giving a presentation basically at this conference about like whether or not it seems to improve confidence in elections to bring people in. And it seems to, right? Like it seems to help. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Maricopa County in Arizona, which is where Phoenix is, at least in the last recorder's administration, that was a really big thing that they did. They did tours of the local election offices, and particularly in a place like Arizona where their elections are close. I think that's like such a vital thing to provide. So election officials, they seem to like doing it. I mean, it's another thing we're adding to their job description, which is already incredibly long, but they are like, I think knowing your election officials, getting to know that office, getting to know those people, maybe becoming one of those people. They're some of like my favorite people that I get to work with. So I cannot recommend that enough for increasing your own trust and the trust of those around you.
And while we're talking about increasing the trust of those around you, I think it's also important to like be cognizant and careful that you are not contributing to election conspiracies.
Yeah.
Like if the election doesn't go the way that you would like it to, don't immediately jump to, oh, there's something fishy going on here.
Right. I mean, I think that that's another really important factor. I think that we have viewed denial of election results, denial of the 2020 election results as a very partisan thing. That like election denialism is something that has been limited to one party. And certainly one party has become the leader in election denialism. I'm not going to deny that.
The ones who are actually like, making legal challenges and like
for sure
starting armed insurrections.
For sure. Definitely.
Yeah, they aren't equal, but there is a history of election questioning at the very least on the side of the Democratic Party as well.
Yeah.
Definitely.
We don't want to do both. We don't want to both sides this.
We don't want to both sides it.
We don't want to both sides it. But I do want to say like election officials hear it no matter what side it's coming from, right? Like if the Democrats are saying it, if the Republicans are saying it, like they are often they can be hit from both sides. And just because I think we saw following 2020 a few instances in which Democrats who did not like the results of their elections came out and said, like, well, really, I think there was foul play here. Or I think they use words like rigged, they use words like corrupt. There are lots of things about our politics that are corrupt, right? Like we could talk about money. We could talk like there's so many things that we could talk about. But I think it's important to be specific when we're talking about the administration of an election, because saying that the administration of that election was done incorrectly, that was corrupt, it's a very hard accusation to walk back. And it's one that is obviously very personal to these election officials and can have an enormous impact on the lives of those election officials, right? Like we saw in Georgia what happened to some of the election officials who faced this sort of like fraudulent scrutiny, right? They get death threats, they leave the occupation in droves, and we're left with elections without people running them who have the important institutional knowledge that we need to carry them out. So, definitely don't want to both sides. I don't think this is a situation where where we should both sides, but think before you speak about an election, and whether, if you're speaking from just anger because your guy didn't win, maybe like go to bed and wake up in the morning and think about it before you press send on the tweet.
In an effort to avoid both sidesing it, right? Don't let it become a both sides issue. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't start doing the things that Republicans are doing. I do want to pick up on one thing you said there, Maddie, about like turnover and people leaving these offices. A couple of our colleagues at UCLA, Dan Thompson and Josh Farrar, have a paper where they look at the turnover of election officials, and this turnover has gone up a lot in recent years.
Yeah.
It's been fairly consistent over the last like 2 decades or so, that like every election we basically have fewer people who were in the role during the last election. As of right now, their results suggest that this isn't having a super strong negative impact on elections, which is good. But it is concerning. And like just because it's not currently having a negative impact on elections doesn't mean that at a certain point, if there's some sort of threshold we haven't hit yet, right? There is no reason to currently believe that this is ruining election administration, but it is something to
the tipping point might be.
Yeah, it's something to keep an eye on, right? It's certainly not. Its valence isn't neutral, shall we say?
Yes, and I don't recall the details of that paper. I know, like, I'd be curious if they look not just across the board at the election officials leaving, but in states where they would also be most likely to get this sort of harassment, right? Because like an election official in New York might not be harassed the same way that an election official in Arizona or Pennsylvania is going to seek harassment. I mean, I know there have been counties in some of these swing states where, we've seen their elections director turn over multiple times. Like in Nevada, for example, I think it's Washoe County. At one point we were on like the interim for the interim for the interim on a county clerk. Because why would you want to do that job if you're getting death threats, right? Like, what's worth that?
And even if it's not happening in a systematic way, which wouldn't show up in this kind of paper that uses like a bunch of data for thousands of counties over 20 years, right? Even if it's happening in just a couple of places, that's a problem for the people who live there, right?
Totally.
It's like an unequal access to the franchise, and it hurts those people's trust in elections. And as we were talking about earlier, even if these things aren't happening in a systematic way, they get reported on because they are interesting, right? They're departures from the norm. And so even if it's just a couple of counties in Georgia, a couple of counties in Nevada, a county or two in Arizona, that occupies a much bigger place in the public imagination, even if it's not happening at this systematic level. And if our goal is, as we're talking about today, right, to reject these conspiracy theories, to improve trust in elections, then that perception matters. That perception really matters. I want to move on a little bit to actual policies that we can pursue. And the first one of these, I think, is something we sort of touched on earlier, but didn't go into depth about, is funding elections properly, right? Lots of people are, shall we say, disinclined to give more money to elections, right? The Fact of the matter here really is that it's been a long time since we have funded elections in a way that allows them to modernize, allows them to buy the types of equipment that they need to deal with, growing populations in most of the country. We mentioned earlier the Help America Vote Act, which I think is 2002, if I'm remembering right.
Yeah, 2001 or 2002.
2001, 2002. That act is like the last big cash infusion that most election offices have gotten 23 years ago at this point. And it's also, coincidentally, at the same time that they were buying all of those DRE machines, it's when they bought all of those like computers that run on Windows Vista that they haven't been able to update since then. The reason that you haven't been able to update these operating systems, the reason you haven't been able to update the technology, is you don't have the money. Right. And so I think the first and foremost thing that we need to do, the thing that makes all of the rest of it work, is funding elections properly so they can, accurately and appropriately implement all of the other things we're about to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, HAVA, one good thing that HAVA did is it did establish a grant program, and that grant program persists beyond 2002. I did a quick look up. It is 2002. You're right. So, there is still money that can come from the federal government. But as we touched on earlier, elections are beneficial at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. All of those groups should be responsible for funding our elections. So we need federal funding, we need statewide funding, we need local funding. And there are a lot, there are nonprofits out there. There are portions of my own nonprofit that I don't work with directly that are dedicated and spend a lot of time on trying to make sure that elections have the funding that they need. So I am certainly an advocate for more money going to elections. I don't really think it's an area to skimp on. I think we are a democracy. That is sort of something that we value as a nation. We're a republic. I'm sure someone would like to argue that with me, but we vote. People vote in elections. We want those elections to go well.
Even if we're a republic, we got to have the elections to pull that off.
Exactly. So, we want to make sure that those elections are run well, that the people running them are paid properly, that we're using equipment that is safe and secure. That costs money. It costs money. And I think that it's something that we should fund properly as a nation.
In the interest then of funding elections properly, what would you say are maybe if you were elections czar, if you could just choose some policies to implement, right? What would be the top 3 things that you would do to help secure election administration in this country? I know it's a big question I'm hitting you with. So if you need me to vamp for a little bit longer while you think about it, I'm happy to do that.
Well, I think I would say that this is an instance where my identity as someone who's very interested in election administration intersects with my identity as someone who cares a lot about voter access. And so those 2 things come together for me. And I do think that, when elections are accessible to voters, they're also at their best. So maybe this is not exclusively an admin angle, but it's something that I think is important. People need to be able to cast a ballot, and casting a ballot during 1 8-hour period on a single day is not super accessible. So I would say my first move as elections czar is to make sure that voters have a collection of options that work for them and their state. And I say that sort of delicately because while I am personally an evangelist for mail ballots, and you both live in states where they mail everyone a ballot, I live in Washington, D.C., we also mail everyone a ballot here. Some states don't want to do that. They are really against it. In a lot of cases, they don't have the infrastructure for it. Honestly, it requires a lot of equipment. It requires major investment. If their election administration is super localized, it can be difficult because now we really want to take it up to the state or the county level if we're going to do something major like that. So I'm not saying you have to mail everyone a ballot, but give people in-person voting options before election day, right? Allow at the very least no excuse mail ballot access. So you don't have to say, I'm out of the country at my brother's wedding and that's why I can't vote. No, right? You can just request your mail ballot and then you can receive your mail ballot. Have a permanent mail ballot list for people who are going to want to vote by mail year over year so that they don't have to re-register every time. That is imposing an additional burden on voters that we really shouldn't be imposing. So that's probably my first move as elections czar. Then I would say my second move, as elections are, is I would love for every state, I have some colleagues who I think will laugh at this. I would love for every state to just reread their election code and make it better. Just like sometimes it's just so difficult to understand
that's completely reasonable.
Sometimes you're reading them and you think, I don't even know what you meant when you wrote that. And I don't know if anyone knows what you meant when you wrote that. And it's hard to sort of make these general suggestions about what a state should do because every state is a special snowflake and they do things their own way. But to the extent that states can have more cohesive systems of elections where they incorporate all of those supportive policies that we've talked about, I think that would go such a long way. So if you have a lot of mail ballots, you should have pre-processing, right? Like if you have a lot of early in-person voting, like you should have vote centers, which means that people can go and vote anywhere in a county instead of having to go to a specific precinct.
Yeah, they don't have to go just to one place that's like close to where, or maybe not close to where they live in many instances, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like if you have more mail ballots, you should have drop boxes. If you have people who move around a lot, you should have same day voter registration. There are a lot of these supportive policies that states need and that often people sort of outside of the election space aren't thinking about that make elections work. And then like the last thing I would sort of say is if we're thinking about election policy, we should always be thinking about the implementation of that policy and the election officials because someone has to do it, right? Like the rubber hits the road and someone has to put that policy into action. And election officials are the people who know what it's going to take to get from A to B. And so it's important to consult them. You might not always agree, but in a lot of cases, they have information that you need. Like how long does it really take once they get a ballot for that ballot to be fully processed, right? Like how long is it from the close of election day polls to certification? And what are all of the little steps that have to happen between those two things? Because in a lot of cases, deadlines like certification, deadlines like, approval of ballots before they get mailed out, those are set in code. And so if you impose these other restrictions, you jeopardize the ability of the election officials to meet those deadlines, which are already set in stone. And so asking people to sort of like zoom out and think about the process holistically, I think will do a lot.
In short, you don't want to pass policies that can't actually be implemented.
What a wild suggestion.
I have one of my mom's brother, her younger brother, does a significant amount of the HR for the Park Service. And he's like a public administration guy, like has an MPA and all that. And he has this line that like the guys who have MPPs, like the Masters of Public Policy folks, are always writing up policies that then the MPAs have to like fix. Because the public policy people are always like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we did this cool, complex policy that like nudges people in the right direction without giving them any information that would distort their incentives? And then he's like, you can't do that. It won't work. Our computers run on Windows XP.
Right.
The number of times I wrote policies for the Oregon State Police that were physically impossible. Oh, well.
And, it happens all the time, but I think grounding, particularly election policy work, which is going to be just poured over with a fine-tooth comb, like making sure that policy is implemented and doing what you want, right? Which in a lot of cases is enfranchising voters, is making the system more secure, is getting you results faster, right? Like it should actually do that. We would really love for it to actually do that. I have had to sit so many times with a calendar and go through, okay, this is election day. This is certification day. We have 3 days for this. We have 4 days for this. A state court can do this on this date, and mapping that out. And I think it should make everyone feel like the system is secure because there are a lot of rules around what you can do, but it's always something that you have to consider when you have these grander plans of making sure that our election system and our democracy serves all of us to the best of its ability.
Serves all of us is noticeably serving all of us, right?
Right.
And like has this not only actual competence, right, actual security, but the perception of competence and security. And as we've gone sort of in the through line here, a lot of this involves just when people are able to vote, when it's seamless for them, and when they don't experience any horrible hiccups, hour-long lines, right? 2-hour, 3-hour long lines. They have more confidence in the system.
Yeah. And, I think sort of as we touched on a little bit before, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but there are very legitimate reasons for people to be skeptical of our election system, because at times it really has not served all Americans, and it still fails to serve all Americans a lot. I think like the Voting Rights Act is, in the history of our country, like a pretty recent act. Long lines, Clayton, as you mentioned, we haven't really talked about lines and like the myths or truths around lines, but like lines in places with Black and brown voters is still very common. There are like lots of systemic issues to our election system and things that do disenfranchise voters.
Yeah. Like the stories in North Carolina, for example, where like their racial gerrymander, the court said, I think in these specific words, if I'm remembering right, that it targeted Black voters. Oh no, this is a voter ID law, not the gerrymander. But they've done a number of these bad things. But
they certainly have done it on a gerrymander.
The voter ID law, they wrote targeted Black voters with almost surgical precision. It was specifically intended to stop Black people from voting. And this is something that we haven't even had time to talk about, right?
Right. It's a whole other episode, and I don't want to blow over in telling people, to trust our election system.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to gloss over the fact that, many communities have very legitimate reasons to have issues and have questions for our election system. But I think what we're talking about, or at least trying to drill down on the more administrative side of things, is that we can fund these elections better. We can talk about these elections better. We can build trust in the people who run the elections. Maybe not the people in Washington, maybe not the people in the legislature who are going to try to pass policies that are going to do both good and bad things. But for the most part, the everyday Americans working in election offices are working to the best of their ability on the whole. And it's sort of combating the conspiracy theories that I think we can try to move the needle on, even if there's still a lot more room for progress.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's as good a time as any, perhaps, to call the episode. We'll have to bring you back again, Maddie, to talk about the other dimensions of this that we only very briefly got into here at the end.
There's always more.
There's always more. There's always more. But until then, until we bring you back to talk more about it, hopefully this has been helpful in helping people understand how to reject election conspiracies and embrace working the polls. And until next time, I have been Clayton Becker.
I've been Megan Cox.
I've been Maddie Covino.
There we go. And we will see you next time.